There is a hidden power in a revenge that is served with a velvet touch and a steady, unwavering hand. Witness the smooth, calculated path of those who finally took back what was theirs. Hit subscribe now and see the ultimate price of a broken promise.
The coffee in my hand was still hot, but I couldn't feel it anymore. There were 43 people seated around the long mahogany table in my father's conference room. Lawyers, accountants, family members in their Sunday best, and my stepbrother's wife, who kept patting her husband's arm like he was a dog she'd just won at auction. The rating of my father's estate was supposed to be a formality. He'd told me, personally, 6 months before he died, that the controlling share of Alderton Capital, the firm he built from a one-room office in Pittsburgh, the firm where I had worked every summer since I was 16, the firm where I now led the entire forensic due diligence division, was going to me. He told me. Those were his words. Sitting in his study, his hands wrapped around a mug of chamomile tea because the doctors had taken away his coffee, he'd looked at me and said, "You're the only one who ever understood what this company actually was." So I sat in that conference room holding my coffee and I waited. The estate attorney, a thin man with silver cufflinks and the energy of someone who had delivered bad news so often it no longer registered on his face, opened the folder. He cleared his throat. He began reading. My stepbrother received the controlling share. I didn't move. I didn't speak. I kept my face the way I'd trained it to stay in boardrooms where men twice my age tried to read my reaction before I'd finished thinking. Neutral. Present. Giving away nothing. My stepbrother looked at me from across the table. He had the grace, barely, to glance away first. Before I tell you what happened next, drop a comment and tell me where you're watching from and what time it is. I want to know how far this goes. My name is Rosalind, and I am 31 years old. I have a master's degree in financial forensics from Carnegie Mellon and 4 years of experience combing through the financial records of companies that people were desperately trying to hide things inside of. I do not panic. I do not cry in conference rooms. I do not let people see the moment the ground drops out from under me. What I do is think. I have always been a thinker, and in that conference room, even as the attorney kept reading through the itemized bequests, the vacation property to my stepbrother, the investment accounts split between him and his wife, my father's personal vehicle to my stepbrother, my father's watch collection to my stepbrother, I was already thinking. Something was wrong. Not emotionally wrong. I mean structurally wrong. Legally wrong. The kind of wrong that you can feel before you can prove, the way you can smell a gas leak before you can find it. Let me give you some context, because you need to understand what Alderton Capital actually is before you understand what was being taken from me. My father started the firm when I was 4 years old. My mother left when I was 6. Not dramatically, not cruelly, just quietly. The way some people leave when they realize they have built a life that doesn't fit them. She moved to Oregon. We still talk. She knew what this company meant to my father and to me. My stepbrother came into the picture when I was 12, when my father married his mother. His name is Ebias, and I will simply say this plainly, not someone who ever showed any particular interest in finance or in work in general. He is charming. He is good at parties. He remembers people's birthdays and tells the kind of jokes that make older men in golf shirts laugh. He has worked, nominally, in the firm's client relations department for the past 6 years, which in practice meant he took clients to dinners and occasionally forwarded emails. I loved my father. I want to be clear about that. I'm not telling this story as a woman who hates her family. I'm telling it as a woman who watched something very specific happen over the last 18 months of her father's life and who finally understands what it was. My father got sick in the spring of the year before he died. Pancreatic cancer. The prognosis was bad from the beginning, and he knew it, and he handled it with the same methodical quietness he had handled everything in his life. He kept working as long as he could. He started getting his affairs in order. He had long conversations with lawyers and with me and, apparently, with my stepbrother, though I didn't know the content of those conversations until the day in the conference room. What I did know, what I noticed and filed away and kept watching, was that my stepbrother's wife started coming to Sunday dinners. She had never come before. She was a pleasant woman who worked in real estate development and who had, over the course of those 18 months, developed a sudden deep interest in my father's comfort, his medication schedule, his daily routine, and his feelings about the company's long-term future. I noticed. I didn't say anything. He was dying, and I was not going to make his last year a war zone. But I noticed. Back to the conference room. The attorney finished reading. People began gathering their copies of the documentation. My stepbrother's wife was already on her phone, probably texting someone. My stepbrother stood up and walked around the table toward me, and I watched him coming the way I watch everything, calmly, already reading the calculation behind his expression. He wanted to seem kind. He wanted the room to see him being kind to me. He said he hoped I understood, and that he wanted to honor my father's vision, and that, of course, my position at the firm was secure, and he hoped we could work together going forward. I said, of course. He couldn't tell if I meant it. That's the point. I waited until the room had mostly cleared. I walked to the window and looked out at the parking lot for a long moment. Then I opened my bag, took out my laptop, and got to work. Here's what people don't understand about financial forensics. Most of my job isn't about catching something in the act. It's about reading documents, months, sometimes years of documents, and finding the thing that isn't there, an absence, a gap, a number that should exist but doesn't, or a transaction that was structured very carefully to look like something ordinary. I had been doing my father's personal financial review as part of his estate planning. He had asked me to explicitly 8 months before he died. He trusted me with his numbers the way he trusted me with almost nothing else. And I had done it thoroughly the way I do everything, but I have focused on the business holdings and the investment accounts, not on the estate documents themselves, because those were being handled by the attorneys and he had told me the decision was made. What I had not done, what I did that afternoon, sitting in my car in the parking lot of the building my father had built, was run a full document metadata analysis on the will itself. I'm not going to explain every step of that process because it would take another hour, but here is the short version. A will that has been prepared, reviewed, and signed over time has a particular kind of document history. Changes leave traces. Amendments have filing dates. Signature pages have timestamps embedded in the PDF metadata that don't lie, even when the paperwork is arranged to look clean. My father's will had been amended 14 weeks before his death. Not revised, amended, through a codicil that had been added quietly, witnessed by 2 people I didn't recognize, and filed in a way that was technically legal, but structured to be as unobtrusive as possible. The codicil changed the controlling share distribution. I sat in my car for a long time. My father's cognitive status in the final 3 months of his life had been, this is a documented medical fact, not my opinion, significantly impacted by his pain management medication. His oncologist had noted it. His primary care physician had noted it. I had seen it myself in the way his sentences would sometimes drift, the way he would start a thought and arrive somewhere unexpected. I had thought it was grief for his own life. I had not thought to be afraid of it as a legal vulnerability. 14 weeks before he died, that was exactly the window. I want to be careful here because I am not someone who makes accusations lightly. I have spent my entire career in the uncomfortable space between suspicion and proof. I know the difference between what I believe and what I can demonstrate. So I will say only this. I had questions. I had significant, specific, document-supported questions, and I knew exactly who to ask them to. Not my stepbrother, not yet. I called an attorney I had worked with twice on fraud cases, a woman named Buchanan who had the manner of a librarian and the instincts of a prosecutor. I sent her the metadata analysis. I sent her the medical records I already had access to as part of the estate process. I sent her the timeline. She called me back in 40 minutes. She said, "When do you want to file?" We spent the next 6 weeks building the case quietly. I went to work every day. I attended the transition meetings my stepbrother scheduled. I answered emails professionally and on time. I made no unusual requests and asked no alarming questions. My stepbrother's wife invited me to lunch twice, and I went both times and I talked about the firm's Q3 projections and asked polite questions about her development projects. I was not waiting to explode. I was waiting to be precise. What I was specifically looking for, what Buchanan and I were building toward, was the witnesses. The 2 people who had signed the codicil. Witness signatures on a legal document create a paper trail that is very hard to scrub. Those 2 names were not family. They were not longtime employees of the firm. One of them, when I ran a standard background search, had a professional history that included 3 years working as an administrative assistant at the same real estate development company where my stepbrother's wife was a senior partner. I'm going to let you sit with that for a moment. I didn't need an explosion. I had a thread, and I knew how to pull it. The firm had a quarterly board meeting scheduled 8 weeks after the reading of the will. It was a routine meeting, financials, strategic overview, personnel updates. My stepbrother would be chairing it for the first time in his new capacity as controlling shareholder. He had prepared a presentation. His wife had helped him with it. I knew this because I had seen the draft file in the shared server under her initials. I had been preparing too. The morning of the board meeting, I arrived early. I set up my materials. I had a copy of the standard quarterly report I had prepared, because that was my actual job and I do it regardless of personal circumstances. I also had a separate folder, which I did not open or acknowledge until the moment was exactly right. My stepbrother opened the meeting with the easy confidence of someone who believes the room has already accepted his authority. He thanked the board members for their continued trust. He spoke warmly about my father's legacy. He said he looked forward to honoring that legacy in his new role. I watched him. I watched the board members. I watched his wife, who was sitting against the wall, not at the table, technically not part of the meeting, with her phone in her lap. When he opened the floor for any preliminary business, I raised my hand. He looked at me. Something shifted in his expression, briefly, before he put the easy smile back. Rosalind. I said I had a matter of legal due diligence that needed to be addressed before we proceeded, per my obligations as the firm's head of forensic review, and I placed a copy of the document packet in front of each board member. The room changed. There is a particular quality of silence that falls when people understand that something is happening that they were not expecting. Not the polite silence of attention, the arrested silence of recalculation. I walked them through it, simply and without drama. The codicil, the filing date, the metadata, the witness signatures, the employment history of witness number 1. The timeline relative to my father's documented cognitive decline. I did not call it fraud out loud. I did not need to. I presented it as a series of facts requiring legal clarification before the board could, in good conscience, proceed under the current estate distribution. My stepbrother said my name twice, his voice climbing the second time. I said, I'm not finished. I placed one more document in front of each board member. It was a letter from Buchanan's firm, copied to the county probate court, formally notifying all relevant parties of a pending legal challenge to the codicil on grounds of undue influence and testamentary incapacity. The challenge had been filed that morning. His wife stood up from the wall. I watched her face do the thing that faces do when a plan that felt solid turns out to have been paper. My stepbrother's voice, when he found it, was very quiet. He asked what I thought I was doing. I said, my job. I said it the same way I say everything in boardrooms, without heat, without apology, because it was true. It was exactly my job. Identifying documents that had been manipulated, building the evidentiary record, and presenting it to the appropriate parties. I had done it for companies I had never met. I had done it for clients who were strangers. I was doing it now for my father. One of the senior board members, a man who had known my father for 20 years and who had looked deeply uncomfortable since the moment I opened the folder, asked the room to pause the formal meeting and allow for an emergency executive session, which is exactly what should happen when a controlling shareholder's ownership position is under active legal challenge. My stepbrother said he would fight it. I said, that's what the process is for. I closed my folder. I picked up my coffee. I told them I had the quarterly financial report ready whenever they were prepared to hear it, and I sat back and waited. The legal process took 4 months. I'm not going to walk through every filing because this isn't a law school case study, but here is what the process found. The codicil had been prepared by an attorney who had no prior relationship with my father and had been engaged specifically for that document. The engagement had been coordinated through my stepbrother's wife's assistant, the same assistant who was witness number 1. The second witness was her cousin, whose name she had apparently believed would be harder to trace. There is a particular kind of calculation that assumes no one is watching carefully enough. It's the same calculation I have seen in every embezzlement case, every fraudulent transfer, every carefully structured transaction that was designed to look ordinary. People who do these things believe that the paperwork is the reality, that if the documents say a thing, the thing is true. They forget that documents have histories, and I read histories for a living. The codicil was invalidated. The original distribution was restored. I received the controlling share of Alderton Capital, which my father had intended, which he had told me, which was his and therefore mine. My stepbrother did not come to the firm after the ruling. His wife did not either. I don't know what their situation is now, and I find that I have very little energy to spend on the question. What I spent my energy on, in the weeks after the ruling, was the company. The actual company. The one my father had built from nothing, which was now mine to steward. I scheduled a full operational review. I restructured 2 departments that had been running inefficiently for years. I promoted 3 people who had been overlooked. I had the conference room repainted because the dark mahogany, everything had always felt more like a funeral than a workplace, and my father had been gone long enough that the room could be something other than a monument. I did not make a speech. I did not hold a celebration. I sent a company-wide email that was 6 sentences long and said, essentially, that the legal matter had been resolved, that the firm was stable, and that I was looking forward to the work ahead. The last thing I did that day was sit at my father's desk, my desk, and open his old leather calendar, which had been sitting in the top drawer since the estate had been settled. He had kept a paper calendar his entire life, long after everyone around him had moved to digital. On the date of my birth, 31 years ago, he had written 2 words in his careful, even handwriting. I closed the calendar and put it back in the drawer. I had already known what it said. He'd shown me once, when I was very young, and told me that on the day I was born, he had written down what he believed I was going to be. He was right. He had always been right about me. I locked the office door and went home. There's a moment, somewhere in the middle of all of it, when I realized that what my stepbrother and his wife had miscalculated wasn't just the law. It was me. They had watched me for years, quiet at family dinners, focused on work, not the one who fought for attention, or made scenes or demanded to be recognized. And they had confused that quietness with passivity. They thought because I didn't perform my strength, I didn't have any. That was their first mistake, and in the end, it was the only one that mattered. I think about what my father built, not just the firm, but the discipline it took to build it. He came from nothing. He understood that what you create through real effort has a different kind of weight than what you acquire through shortcuts. He tried to pass that understanding on to me, not through speeches, but through years of showing me what it actually looked like to do the work, to be honest with the numbers, to refuse to fudge the ledger even when it would have been easier. That was the inheritance that mattered. The controlling share was just paper. What I've learned, and I mean this in the plainest, most practical sense, is that integrity is structural. It's not a feeling you have about yourself. It's a set of choices you make when no one is watching, that quietly determine what's available to you when everything is. I spent years building a reputation for accuracy and honesty in my professional work, not because I was thinking about this day, but because that's the only way I know how to operate. And when the day came that I needed those credentials to mean something, they did. The court didn't take my challenge on faith. They took it because I had the documentation, the methodology, the professional standing. Character had quietly become evidence. And then there's the question of what you do with your mind when circumstances are working against you. I could have walked out of that conference room and spent the next 6 months in grief and outrage. Both would have been completely understandable. Both would have cost me everything. What I did instead was think, carefully, slowly, without letting the anger speed me up past the details. That kind of discipline, the ability to stay precise when everything in you wants to be loud, is not something you find on the day you need it. You build it before. Every time you slow down when you want to rush. Every time you check the numbers twice when once would have felt like enough. Rosalind didn't win because she was lucky, or because she was the favorite, or because the universe decided to be fair. She won because she had spent years becoming someone who could not be outmaneuvered with paperwork, because she understood that the real power in any room is always held by the person who has done the most thorough reading. I locked that office door and drove home, and I thought about my father's handwriting in that calendar. 2 words, 31 years old. I already knew what they said. Some things are just a matter of time.